Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Crystal Lee. She is a PhD candidate at MIT and a fellow at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And today we're going to talk about data visualizations, online misinformation, politics, and so on. So, Crystal, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, for this invitation. It's a privilege to talk with you.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so let's start with data visualizations because that's one topic you focus a lot in your work. What is the kind of thing we're talking about here?
Oh, it's a really expansive term. I guess in terms of a lot of the data visualizations that I study online, I think one thing to distinguish is I'm interested in the kind of visual culture around data visualization, but maybe more importantly, I'm kind of interested in the social ecosystem around which data visualization lives. So the way that people talk about how they use data to make decisions, the way that they talk about data as a way to justify certain kinds of policies, how they manipulate data, or how certain information can be rendered visible through graphics. So whether it be line charts, bar charts, infographics, I think it's a really expansive term.
hmm But I mean, you work at the intersection, I guess, between several different disciplines, like, for example, history and ethnography, to try to understand the sort of cultural factors that play a role in how people interpret and make data visualizations, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So, and how do data visualizations apply to certain specific topics? Like, for example, do you study how they apply in the realm of politics?
Yeah, so the major study that I've done that's published in ACM-CHI, which is computer-human interaction, is really about how data visualizations have been mobilized, particularly in the United States, on social media to either justify social distancing restrictions or in many cases to try to really resist things like mask guidance, lockdown orders. I think there are a range of policies that exist in the US right now about how to deal with a pandemic, and really the kind of ecosystem that I was interested in was a kind of category of of what we call anti-mask protesters, who are really trying to resist a whole swath of policies that in many ways I think is quite dangerous. And I think the study is really about how maybe standard data visualizations as espoused in mainstream media like CNN or the Financial Times most famously, how those exist in how those seem diametrically opposed to a lot of the visualizations that are shared by a lot of these anti-mask Facebook groups and on Twitter. So these are the kinds of things that we tried to study historically and ethnographically to get a kind of more granular understanding of how people talk about data.
But in the case of these groups that are anti-mask and anti-social distancing and other stuff like that, they are manipulating data, right?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you want to think about manipulating. I think so. The kind of hypothesis that we kind of came into, and I think this is a kind of thought that is shared throughout a lot of computer science statistics, like this kind of research that's grounded in data visualization more broadly. I think there's a kind of impulse to talk about how a lot of these kinds of data visualizations are either the result of willful manipulation or ignorance. And in that sense, what's necessary are these renewed initiatives to teach people how to read data, to teach them how to think about science. When in reality, I think what our study showed is that a lot of the methods that might be a part of this kind of wave of data literacy are things that a lot of these anti-mask groups show in all sorts of ways. So when it comes to being critical about data sources or being really cognizant of how certain visualization types can provide certain kinds of insights. I mean, I think these are the real factors and the real practices that we've been able to uncover in this study.
Mhm. But I mean, in that case, are there certain traits that these people share and that explain why they divulge this kind of misinformation?
Oh, absolutely. So I think the two main ones that we point out in the study are first the refocus on deaths rather than cases. So I think a lot of the media attention, at least in the US, is about how there are just these rising number of cases, I mean, in the millions, in a way that seems really unstoppable. And I think a lot of these groups completely discount this statistic. They think that, whether or not someone tests positive, is dependent on a whole swath of things. I think for some of these groups, they really double down on the fact that certain hospitals or certain healthcare groups might be more financially incentivized to give people a positive test rather than a negative one because they'll get some kind of benefit. And so I think in many ways, like the kind of fixation on how lossy of a category positive versus negative tests are leads them to completely shift focus on deaths. So I think a lot of the analysis then becomes rejected by these groups. I think the other trick is to really question how their personal experience locally maps onto these statewide or even nationwide statistics. So I think in a lot of municipalities, they don't necessarily have resources to collect data in as robust a way as maybe on like the county or even the state level. And so in a lot of ways, in their personal experience, they may not know someone who has COVID or, within their larger social circle. And so for their personal experience to be at such odds with the kind of statewide and nationwide statistics makes them feel as if there's some kind of trickery going on at these larger scales. And so it's easier for them to kind of reject this kind of analysis and try to do their own.
Mhm. Do you know if this kind of behavior has any sort of correlation with political orientation? So, for example, could it be the case that people who lean more right or left, for example, are more prone to promoting this kind of misinformation and sharing it and stuff like that?
So I am hesitant, of course, to like make super big generalizations, but I will say in these specific groups that we studied and in the tweets that we studied, it does seem to like there does seem to be like a large propensity in the discourse to kind of talk about preserving one's freedom and uh, preserving freedom, having the freedom to move about in a way that makes sense for them, making your own personal choice as opposed to accepting the kind of totalitarian and unjustified sense of regulation on the part of like a state or a nationwide guidance. I think there's a lot of rejection of this kind of authority. So I will say in the particular groups that we studied, which I have to anonymize, there are also a lot of calls to attend Trump rallies. And so obviously this was in the past year before the election. And so I think there's a kind of mapping of the discourse between rejecting a lot of these social distancing guidelines, broadly speaking, and trying to preserve freedom.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand. So, I mean, I asked you that question because I was just trying to think that perhaps people who share misinformation online, it's not because they're ignorant or stupid exactly, but because they are in a way trying to signal their belonging to a particular social group.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think like a lot of the things that they talk about, especially when it comes to the specific data, maps onto a lot of this rhetoric that, exactly as you say, signals membership in certain groups. I mean, I think, yeah, rejecting the things that the CDC might say, and therefore rejecting a lot of like mainstream media narratives that kind of show how alarming COVID is in the US. I mean, I think this is part of like a broader ecosystem of ideas that I would say leans farther to the right in the US.
So, but to understand people's behavior online and more specifically on social media, is it important for us to study how people interact with computers?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think so. I can talk about it within the context of the study and then with a context more broadly to my research. So I think given that that's one of my main interest areas, like I feel incentivized just to say yes to convince people that this is something they should think about. I think in particular with this case, I mean, we can talk about computers more broadly. Like it's not just about like the physical device, it's about a computing system. So I think when we're talking about people's interactions with data visualizations, they're also talking about the limitations and the promises of what their computer can do for them. So, I mean, I think there are things that, like, on a very granular, maybe even banal level, like, looking at a data visualization on your mobile phone, for example, people might say, like, oh, this is really manipulative because since it's designed on mobile, like you can't zoom in as much as you could on a big screen. And like, that might be an argument for why a particular data visualization doesn't show the truth. When in reality, like, this is a larger phenomenon about people's trust or not in particular kinds of information, especially mediated through devices like mobile phones and social media and their computers more broadly.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe perhaps there would be some differences in between how people interact online and how they interact in other social settings, in real life, let's say.
I see. So, I mean, I think maybe a way to kind of break that down, at least this is how I broke it down for me myself when I first started doing this research, is that like obviously there are differences between working in digital spaces as opposed to meet space. That being said, I think a lot of what happens in digital spaces enables people to organize in meat space, and especially in public settings like rallies and protests, etc. So, I mean, I think as far as the specific groups that we studied, I think what was really compelling was that a lot of these groups, were doing a lot of screen shares, having interviews with congressional candidates, organizing to go to protests and rallies. And so, I mean, I think I do see that translation from online action into, brick and mortar action.
Right. So are you saying then that the kinds of behaviors people exhibit online translate into real life behaviors in the realm of politics, for example?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I certainly think that's true. I mean, I think maybe a different way to think about translation would be to say that people start to reorganize their lives, their worldviews, organize, like interact with other people in ways that might not have been possible without venues like Facebook or Twitter, and that in itself translates into some kind of like real life uh, political action.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe there would be a kind of chicken and egg problem here because, I mean, it could be that people already have their political beliefs and their political attitudes, and then they bring them online and not the other way around.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I guess the chicken egg analogy is perfect for describing exactly this phenomenon in the sense that people bring the political attitudes and assumptions and the conversations that they have offline into online spaces and vice versa. And so you certainly see a dialectical relationship between the things that people think and talk about, with their family members at the dining table and like the things that they might post online. This isn't always true, but I do think in this particular case, there seems to be this correlation.
But when it comes to spreading misinformation, is it that people in general do that, or it's only a few number of people that do it, or that share most of fake news and stuff like that?
So, I mean, I think it's hard for me to say about this case just because I myself did not go to these rallies and ask people whether or not they posted on Facebook groups, frankly, because I'm scared of the pandemic and don't want to go outside. Um, so I think in some senses it's hard for me to say just based on the research. I'm sorry, there was a second part of the question that I forgot.
Yeah, I was asking basically that if spreading misinformation online is something that really has some sort of effect on people's behavior. I mean, if by being exposed to misinformation that really changes their behavior in important ways.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think with this particular case, I mean, maybe this is a little bit too obvious for me to say. I mean, I think people feel enabled to not wear masks in public spaces. I think people share tactics to try to avoid wearing masks in business establishments that might require them. So I think one popular piece of misinformation was to invoke the American with Disabilities Act in order to say, I have a medical condition that precludes my being able to wear a mask. Therefore, like, please respect my legal right to not wear a mask within this establishment, whether it be like a restaurant or a store. I think one thing that was really popular were these cards that people would post online. I think you could also buy like a laminated version, which basically has like a phone number to the Department of Justice or, some other organization that people would basically print out and like give to a store worker in order to prove why they shouldn't wear a mask and be kind of loud about it.
Yeah, there was another part to my previous question that I missed when I asked you the second time. That is, so do we know if misinformation is spread online by most people, or is it only a tiny number of people?
This is hard for me to say, just because we studied such a small set of groups. I mean, I think certainly there are people who are more prolific than others, and like especially within the groups, I think there were a certain set of people who were like the most active in terms of creating these data visualizations and doing, daily, weekly updates with new data. Obviously, because I think, a lot of people have jobs and, other family or other obligations. And so you have these kind of central people who've made this like a new hobby. I mean, I think in the same way that there are certain people who are propagating a lot of these narratives, like those things wouldn't gain traction without a large group of people supporting them, interacting with them, sharing it with other people. So I think, there's certainly a community aspect to it as well as like a centralized figure or
And
figures.
when, yeah, and when it comes to the kinds of media that tend to share misinformation, I mean, there are people that say that mainstream media is very biased, but then we have new media and alternative media. So, do you know if it is one of those kinds of media that tends to share more misinformation?
So in the cases that we looked at, so it wasn't so much about like particular publications like
Okay.
Breitbart. It was more about these groups that, I mean, I would say comprised of normal people that you would find at the grocery store. I think like one of the people that I was really interested in and who posted a ton on these groups, was a high school teacher. Another was a nutritionist. Another, so I think another was a software developer. I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, they have other jobs. This isn't necessarily like, they're not journalists, and they're usually not public health experts. And so this is something that I think they've really taken on as, a significant, I think what they see as like a significant community service.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, at least to me personally, it seemed that some of these fake news surrounding the coronavirus and how to fight it came mostly from, or were propagated mostly on alternative media than mainstream media.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that would generally be the case. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to data visualizations, during this pandemic, we heard a lot about flattening the curve. So is that something that we can use data visualizations to help people make sense of this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think when we first started this project, the surrounding conversation on the flatten the curve graphic was a real starting point for us because I think it's kind of notable as a visualization just for myself anyways because it is by and large data free. Like it is a conceptual visualization more than anything else. And I mean, I think yes, data visualizations like Flatten the Curve and ones dispensed by the CDC and publications like the Financial Times certainly helped people understand the extent and the urgency of the pandemic. At the same time, I think what we've been able to find is that that's not always the case. You might use data visualizations to argue that there isn't a kind of urgency that, public health officials might otherwise talk about.
So that depends on the way you present information, right?
Yeah, the way that you present information, the way that you identify certain data sets as valid or invalid, trustworthy or not trustworthy. I mean, I think there are so many different parts of the visualization pipeline, so to speak, before you actually even get to the graphic.
So this work you're doing on data visualizations, could it help improve how journalists and politicians, for example, communicate?
Possibly. Or at least I like to think so. I try not to be too presumptuous. I think so far the work that I've done hopefully helps people think about how using more data, being able to science things and visualize things isn't an unqualified good. So it's not as if like more data dashboards equals better decisions. Like I think that relationship is a little bit more complicated. But I think ultimately what I hope to do with my dissertation is to show why, or rather how, people, whether it be data visualization experts or journalists, politicians, et cetera, can make data visualizations more accessible to a wider swath of people. So I guess the short answer is yes. In terms of the how, TBD.
Okay, but I mean, so there are certain kinds of visualizations that are easier for people to interpret than others, right?
I don't know if that's the case. I think it's
Okay.
probably pretty context specific. I mean, I think there are certain kinds of data that are better expressed in bar graphs rather than line graphs, especially if it's a time series data. So I'm not trying to avoid the question. I guess I feel like the answer is always sometimes or it's complicated.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe perhaps in certain situations, I mean, I'm not sure if it would be easier to tell people to study data visualizations and tell people what were the most effective ones in trying to convey certain types of information, or if it would be better just to educate people on the different kinds of ways information is conveyed.
I definitely think it's the latter. I think you should definitely pick the visualization type to fit the data rather than the other way around. Just because I think, sometimes if you're always trying to make a bar chart, but the data isn't necessarily good for that kind of visualization, then it's useful to switch. I mean, I think there are a lot of really good books that help you really rethink the relationship between data and its visualization, but more broadly, just to think about the cultural, political, social stakes behind particular kinds of data and how it's collected before you even get to visualization. I think those works are really, really important as we continue to move forward in this field.
Yeah. Do you think we can use this knowledge on data visualizations to help fight back against fake news and misinformation?
Um, that's hard to say. I think maybe what our study has shown is that it's not helpful to fight visualization with visualization because I think ultimately if people have a different reality and use completely separate assumptions that are not necessarily compatible with one another, a visualization is not going to bridge that gap. If people can't, at a baseline, agree on what data is valid or what data should be used in order to make decisions. I like to think that visualizations help people make better decisions. I don't know that they are necessarily the solution to fighting misinformation.
And I mean, data visualizations also influence policy makers, right? I mean, we've been focusing a lot on normal, common consumers, let's say, of journalism and other types of things like that, but they also influence policy makers, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a big impulse to make decisions, policy and otherwise, as data-driven as possible. And I think visualizations are a really easy output because, it's sparkly, beautiful, can be interactive. It's obviously much more fun to interact with a visualization than it is to interact with a spreadsheet. And so I think it is a really compelling tool within someone's toolbox to do any kind of political or quantitative analysis.
Yeah, I think that it was in your work that I read about multi-sensory data visualizations. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, so I think an easy way to think about multisensory visualizations is to think about who's left out when you emphasize data visualizations as a kind of knowledge production. So I think maybe it's a little bit obvious to say, but data visualizations are not accessible to people who cannot see or who have low vision. And so a lot of the work that I'm trying to do, especially in the next year, is to really think about what visualizations would look like if we're not prioritizing sight. Um, so whether that's touch, smell, taste, I think these are all different tools that we have at hand in order to really think about the future of data visualization. And I think really looking at the historical roots of these kinds of visualizations is what I'm really looking at. So I think the history of tactile graphics, of Braille, there are an entire set of visualizations that people have used and pioneered for a really long time. And I think it's really helpful to look at those historical origins as we try to make a multisensory future.
And do you already have any idea about what other kinds of data visualizations that are not visual would work best for people who can't see?
So, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking about, of course, are tactile graphics. So, like raised dots, bumps, based primarily around Braille. Obviously, there are a lot of different problems with that in the sense that, not everybody can read Braille. But I think really thinking about how we can think about tactile ways of approaching knowledge, of approaching data is really where I'm trying to study more.
Mhm. But you're focused then on disabled people, on blind people in this case, or are you also thinking about other sorts of improving how data is presented to people who don't have those sorts of disabilities, but perhaps in a way that improves on what we have?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think certainly a large group of people who I've been in dialogue with are people with who are blind or low vision. But I think I would say that a lot of these kinds of efforts or projects, like I want to think about like really, really large groups of people around the world who are disabled. So, intellectual disabilities, other kinds of physical impairments. Like, I think there are so many different kinds of disability that I really want to be thinking about rather than isolating, particular kinds of needs when it comes to data visualization. So, the short answer is yes, I definitely want to be thinking about like a whole range of disabilities, but also I think it's important to talk about how, how designing something for people with disabilities isn't somehow useful, if not even more helpful for people who don't have those disabilities. So the main uh, the main example that I can come up with are like captions on videos, for example, obviously useful for people who are deaf, but also useful for people watching a video in a loud environment who, don't have headphones, or for people with a second language, for whom, whatever the media is in, they're watching it in their second language. And I think all of those needs, all of those different characteristics all of those people are helped by the existence of captions, and I think tactile data visualizations are not an exception to this.
Mhm. So tell us a little bit more about your methodology. I mean, how are you going to study these topics you're interested in? I mean, for example, how do you go about designing a study to learn more about what are the kinds of ways of presenting data that are better for people who have this or that disability?
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned earlier, I use a lot of archival and ethnographic methods. So I think a lot of what I'm doing is uncovering the kind of long history of these kinds of tactile graphics. I mean, I think people with visual disabilities have been learning things like statistics, math, geography for a really long time, and I think they've been able to create and use technologies that might not be more mainstream, but it's useful to really try to lean on this and, learn from these histories rather than, try to create something completely new. So I'm really thinking a lot about these kinds of historical and archival sources. I think in terms of looking towards looking towards the present, I'm using a lot of ethnography. A lot of it is talking to people, thinking and listening to what people have to say about what they want and need, and like in what kinds of design are the most helpful. So, I mean, I guess the long and short of it is I read a lot about what people say, and I try to listen and talk to people who are thinking about all of these same issues.
Mhm. But I mean, these would also have to be culture sensitive then, right? I mean,
Oh,
you have to take into account the cultural backgrounds of different people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there are all sorts of different kinds of cultural norms around disability and cultural norms around, I mean, even the design of technologies. And so, I mean, if we're going to talk about, like, to kind of harken back to a previous question that you had asked me, people's interactions with computers, like, um, I think a really interesting example for me is the QWERTY keyboard. So, for example, like the QWERTY keyboard is really ideally made for Romanic languages. And I mean, I think thinking about how to adapt the QWERTY keyboard for languages like Arabic or Chinese, for example, requires a lot of different reconfigurings to really think about like the best kinds of, or to think about how people can interact with a piece of technology in a way that makes the most sense linguistically and culturally. And I think these kind of cultural assumptions are embedded in all sorts of different kinds of technologies, and data visualizations are not exempt from this.
And talking about culture, I mean, you are trying to develop ways of presenting information to people who need to be necessarily illiterate, right? Or do you also include pre-literate people from pre-literate societies?
I guess I'm mostly thinking about, so I will say that I don't quite know what you mean by literate and pre-literate societies. I
I
would say,
mean, people, perhaps to put it another way, people who go through formal schooling and know how to read and write.
um, yeah, I would say that that is the case. I think certainly there are a lot of efforts to really think about people who can't either read Braille or read in English, for example. I think that's certainly a place where I want to go. I don't know that I'm there yet. I think there are lots of different hard problems, and I think that's kind of where I'm starting.
Okay. So are you also interested in trying to understand the role that data visualizations play in science?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, like you had mentioned earlier, data visualizations exist in all sorts of different realms. I think science, policy, journalism are all, important cases. And I think the way that people use data visualizations in scientific studies is certainly part of that.
So, and with that, would we also learn something about how scientific research is done based on the kinds of ways information is presented or not?
Sure. I think this is kind of like a reach project, and but something that I've been thinking a lot about is the way that certain scientists are thinking about data visualizations as a way to make AI interpretable. So I think there are a lot of ways in which these kinds of algorithms and AI systems are completely black boxed, and people who make these models don't know how they work, but they work. But being able to really explain why they work or how they work is kind of a hard problem. And I think a lot of computer scientists are looking to things like data visualization in order to do that. So I think for me, the real question there is, can data visualizations actually do what they want to do with it? Is data visualization the right tool? But more than that, like, what does it really mean to have, an algorithmic or an AI system be interpretable? Like, is interpretability or explainability something that we can actually achieve or should achieve?
Yeah, and I mean, do you already have any ideas about that?
So I would say that interpretability and explainability feel like very fuzzy terms that I'm still trying to understand, and I think a lot of people in computer science are trying to understand. Um, I mean, I think there's a larger question about epistemology and interpretation, and I think really grappling with those issues even before we get to the data visualization will be really important.
So, and perhaps this will be my final question. So, you're also trying to make science more accessible to lay people, or not?
Um, Maybe. I guess I don't really know. I guess I'm trying to make data visualizations more accessible to people with disabilities and to people more broadly. So I guess yes. I'm trying to make science more accessible. I guess it's a really capacious question. I like to think that I am, but whether or not I'm successful is we'll see.
Okay, great. So let's end on that note. Before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me on Twitter at CrystalJJ Lee, and they can find me on my website, which I will. I hope that you can probably put it in the link below because I don't think I can say it fully out loud. And I think from there, my email is also visible. So Twitter, internet, and over email.
Okay, great. I will include that in the description box of the interview. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing the channel for more than 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you that it's been running for so long. And so, if you like what I'm doing, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview, and to consider making a pledge there, support the show. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Horowitz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michelle Rugieski, Rosie James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.